box.
Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to try and unlock the black box on what is, without a doubt, one of the most chilling mysteries of the Cold War. We're talking about the day a passenger jet with 269 people on board was just shot out of the sky by a Soviet fighter. Just imagine it. It's the pre-dawn darkness, September 1st, 1983. A Soviet pilot is in his cockpit, and over the radio comes that final order from ground control. His target? An unidentified aircraft that had flown deep into their airspace. And that single order? Well, it had a staggering human cost. 269 people. That's how many were on board Korean Airlines Flight 007. They vanished into the Sea of Japan. And tragically, there were no survivors.
So in the aftermath, the world basically split right down the middle. One side was screaming massacre, a deliberate attack on innocent civilians. The other side? They were calling it a tragic, but maybe even justified mistake, in the super paranoid world of Cold War spying. And that question, massacre or mistake, that's exactly what we're going to dig into right now.
Okay, so let's start with what happened right after the plane went down. The world immediately got two completely different stories. Two totally opposite versions of what happened in the skies over Sakhalin Island. So on one side, you have the West, led by the US, calling it a barbaric act, a crime against humanity. But the Soviet Union, they fired right back. They claimed they'd shot down a US spy plane that was disguised as a civilian jet sent over to deliberately provoke them and test their defenses. It's crazy, right? One single event, but two totally different realities.
All right, to really get to the truth here, we've got to go back in time, not to the explosion itself, but 5 hours before that. We're going inside the cockpit of KAL-007, because that's where a tiny, tiny error was about to set off a chain reaction with catastrophic consequences.
Okay, so for a long-haul flight back then, we're talking Anchorage to Seoul, pilots in the 80s were relying on something called the INS, or Inertial Navigation System. The easiest way to think about it is like a really primitive GPS. You just punch in the coordinates, the waypoints, and the autopilot is supposed to fly that exact route for you. Simple as that.
Now, right after takeoff, the crew had one job. It was super simple. They just had to flip the autopilot from what's called heading mode, which literally just follows a single compass direction, over to INS mode, which is what follows the actual flight plan. But here's the thing. All the evidence from the recovered flight recorders, it's crystal clear. That critical switch, it was never made correctly.
And that one tiny mistake had absolutely massive consequences. See, there's this 7.5-mile window right after takeoff. If the crew either just forgot to engage the INS inside that window, or if they tried to do it too late, the system wouldn't activate. And this is the crazy part. It wouldn't give them any warning. No alarms, no flashing lights. It would just silently keep flying on the last compass heading it had. And that's exactly what KAL-07 did. For 5.5 hours, it flew in a perfectly straight line, hundreds of miles off course, heading straight for some of the most heavily defended Soviet territory on the planet.
This one detail from the cockpit voice recorder just completely blows up the whole tense spy mission theory. What did they find? The crew was bored, they were relaxed, they were literally having casual chats about currency exchange rates. They had absolutely no idea, they were completely oblivious that they were flying straight into the most dangerous airspace on Earth.
So a simple mistake by a crew that just wasn't paying attention, it seems like a pretty clear explanation, right? But it doesn't account for one massive and ultimately fatal coincidence that was happening right at that very moment, just outside Soviet airspace.
So get this. As KAL-07 is flying off course, approaching Soviet territory, there's a U.S. Air Force RC-135 spy plane doing a routine mission nearby. On their radar screens, which you have to remember were pretty primitive back then, the Soviet operators see these two little blips get closer and closer, and then, for about 10 minutes, they merge into one. Now for them, that was the smoking gun. It was proof of a handover, like the spy plane was passing off its mission to a decoy. But here's the thing about that theory. It should have completely fallen apart the second a pilot actually got a look at the plane. A 747 is enormous. It's got that unmistakable hump on top. The two planes look absolutely nothing alike. Which brings up the big question. Did those radar blips ever really merge in the first place? Well, years later, the official investigation, the IKO report, used data from everyone involved, and they proved, nope, they hadn't merged. Not even close. The two planes were never closer than 75 nautical miles to each other. That merged blip was nothing more than a technical glitch, a failure of old Soviet radar that just couldn't tell two separate targets apart. And just like that, a simple coincidence was twisted into a full-blown conspiracy. Okay, so let's recap. The crew was lost. The spy plane theory was built on bad data. So why on earth react with such lethal force? Well, to get that, you have to understand the year this all went down, 1983.
You see, 1983 wasn't just any year. It was arguably the single most dangerous year of the entire Cold War. The Soviet leadership was completely rattled by President Reagan's evil empire speech. They weren't just being dramatic. They genuinely believed the US was getting ready to launch a surprise nuclear attack. So, the entire Soviet military was on a hair trigger, running this massive intelligence program specifically designed to hunt for any sign of, well, exactly this kind of provocation.
So imagine you're one of those ground commanders. You're already primed to expect an attack. Then this unidentified plane shows up on your faulty radar right when a US spy plane is nearby. For them, it confirmed their absolute worst fears. If you read the declassified transcripts, you can almost feel the panic. You have these agitated commanders pressed for time, watching this plane get closer and closer to leaving their airspace, and they make that final fatal call. So at this point, we have a lost crew, we have flawed radar, and we have paranoid generals. It really seems to paint a clear picture of a tragic, almost impersonal accident, right? Well, that whole picture gets turned upside down when we hear from the one person who actually saw the plane with his own two eyes, the pilot who fired the missiles.
Years after the Soviet Union fell, the pilot, a man named Gennady Osipovich, finally gave an interview, and what he said was just jaw-dropping. He admitted that he pulled his fighter jet right up alongside the plane, he saw its flashing navigation lights, he saw the two full rows of passenger windows, and he knew it was a civilian Boeing. Let that sink in. He knew. But then came the justification. And this is what's truly chilling, because it reveals the psychological depth of this whole tragedy. He said what he saw meant nothing to him. Why? Because, in his words, it is easy to turn a civilian type of plane into one for military use. So think about that. He saw a passenger plane, but his training, his paranoia, his orders, they all screamed at him to see a military threat. In his mind, it was a spy plane in disguise. And the most critical part, he never told his commanders on the ground what he saw. He just followed orders. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, you realize this wasn't about one single mistake. It was a horrifying chain reaction, a cascade of failures. You had a technical failure that sent the plane off course, a human failure from a crew that had no idea they'd made a simple mistake, an institutional failure rooted in flawed radar and military paranoia, and finally, a devastating personal failure from a pilot who chose to trust his orders more than his own eyes. It's like every single safety link that could have prevented this just snapped. So what are we left with? A lost crew, paranoid commanders, and a pilot who saw the truth with his own eyes but chose to believe a lie. It was, in every sense, a perfect storm of error and fear that ended with 269 people dead. So in a chain of failures this long, this complex, who is ultimately responsible? We've laid out the evidence. Now, the judgment is yours.